ORM or migrations don't make sense right now, and if you don't know what is a model and how to create it, don't worry. Stay with me and I'll explain everything step by step. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what they mean and how to use them in your project. So Django comes with an ORM, which is an object relational mapper, and the object relational mapper serves as an abstraction layer between your data and your actual database. What this means is that Django handles the database structure and any changes to the database for you. So if you have used other SQL database before, like MySQL or Postgres, and you have developed with something like PHP or other languages, you might remember having to manually write SQL queries, set up database tables, and modify them directly. However, with Django, you don't need to worry about that. Django takes care of all of it for you. All the tedious work like setting up your database, writing SQL statements to add, retrieve, or modify data, and managing columns is handled by Django through its ORM. This allows you to focus on writing the Python code for your application instead of figuring out how to manage database changes in your project. It's truly one of the great features of using Django. Another benefit of this is that it allows you to easily switch between different databases. As long as the database is supported by Django, you can generally swap it out at any point in your project. No, I say within reason, because some features you might use could be specific to a certain database like Postgres or MySQL. In those cases, switching might be a bit more challenging, but for general use cases, if you build your Django application with Postgres, for example, you could usually switch to MySQL with minimal code changes just by updating your database engine settings and installing the required dependencies. However, this isn't something that's very common, but it is useful to know that is an option. So that's what the ORM is. So how do you actually use the object relational mapper? Well, you start by defining what's called models. There are Python classes in your code that inherit from Django's base model class. Once you define your models, you can use Django to execute a command that automatically generates what's called a migration file. A migration file is a Python component that lives in your project, but you don't need to create it manually. Django generates it for you. In most cases, about 99% of the time, you won't need to modify anything inside the migration file unless you have very specific custom requirements. Once you have the migration files, you can run another command to apply these migrations, which will actually set up the database. So Django will handle that for you. And then it will also allow you to store data in the database by interacting with the Python models that you created. If you create a model, you can create a new instance of that model, and Django will handle saving the data to the database and retrieving it the next time you want to access it. So you can see here that once you have defined your models, everything else is pretty much handled by the Django functionality just by running a few management commands. And this makes working with a database quite easy when you are using Django. So let's take a look at models. A model that you create in your project maps to a table in your database. So generally speaking, every model creates a corresponding table in your actual database in Django. Django handles the creation of that table for you. Models contain the following basic elements. So, a name, which is usually the actual name of the class that you use. And then you have fields which correspond to columns in the database. So you have a table named after the model, and within that table you have various fields that represent different pieces of data you might store. And then you might have some other metadata, like maybe you want to have things like relationships between tables and things like that, and you can define them in your models as well, and then they're automatically translated into real tables in your database. Finally, if you want, you can add some custom Python logic. For example, if you want to execute some code every time you save or load a model instance, or if you want to add validation, you can include that in the Python code. So that's your model. Here's an example of a model. So this is a standard model that we are going to be creating later on in this course. And you can see the name here is ingredient. So this is going to map to a table called ingredient inside our project. Then we have various different fields. The first one is just called name. That's the name of the ingredient. And you can see that we have added some metadata. Here we have a char field, which is a character field that allows us to store text. We have also set the maximum length of the entry to 255 characters. Then we have a foreign key field for the user. This essentially creates a relationship. Each ingredient is associated with a user, and each user can create multiple ingredients. There's data stored with each ingredient that indicates which user it belongs to. As you can see, it's defined as a foreign key, which is Django's way of establishing a relationship with another table that we are going to create. We also define behaviors here, such as what should happen when a user is deleted. In this case, we use cascade, which means that if the user is deleted, their associated ingredients will be deleted as well. There are all details of actually creating your models. This is just a general example. There are many different fields available for models. They are available in the official Django documentation. So once you have defined your models, you can then create the migrations. In order to create the migrations, you need to ensure that the app is enabled in the settings.py file. So if your app is not enabled in settings.py, then you're not going to be able to run migrations or create migrations for the app. And then you use the Django CLI, and this is the command that's used to make the migrations for the project. And Django is very smart. It checks the existing database and compares it with your current models and the migrations that already exist. If you have made any changes to your models, like adding a new model or modifying an existing one, Django will create a new migration file to reflect those changes. If it's the first time you are running make migrations, Django will generate an initial migration file which sets up the database based on your current model definitions. Once you have the migrations file, you can again use the Django CLI to run Python manage.py migrate, which would apply the migrations to the configured database. You run this command and Django looks at the migrations files and applies them to the database. If there are changes to apply, it makes those changes. If a migration has already been applied, it skips it and moves on to the next one. It's best to run the migrate command every time you start your application, right after waiting for the database to be ready. So we run our wait for DB command first, and then we run the migrate command. This ensures that the database is available and then applies any pending migrations to make sure all changes are in place before the application starts. So that's an overview of migrations in Django. Now let's move on to the next lesson and update our Docker Compose file configuration.